Okay, so I guess it's another afternoon, and I'm smiling right now, Noel, because there was a couple of ways I wanted to start this conversation, and I'm not exactly sure that they would be as funny to others as they are to me, because I am absolutely smiling. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just start with something really generic.
Mhm.
This should be extremely easy for you to knock it out the park. The very first thing that I want to do with not even how you doing. I want to start with the cheapest $49 that you've ever spent. And I want you to know that I am asking that question for a very specific reason, because if you don't answer it the way that I think you'll answer it, then I'm going to drive you towards an answer. The cheapest $49 that you've ever spent.
Oh, I'm the worst at doing things where I have to choose favorites. I'll tell you recently, I got I decided to reuse some tiles that I'd gotten from Mexico for our wedding years ago. They were gathering dust in the garage, and I spent that $49 at Lowe's. Made some good friends with the people that cut all the wood. I bought the grout. I needed one of those like low stakes craft projects that I could mess up and it was going to be okay. But I feel pretty good. You don't want to look too closely at these boxes, these like side tables that are outdoors, because they look too homemade if you look really close. But if you like step back, you're like, hey, I made that.
So, see, this is part of the problem, because sometimes we ask people questions and we sort of leave them out there and hope that they land the plane where we want them to
And
land.
I
And,
didn't
and
do it.
typically, that's a challenge with human resources. That's a challenge between managers and their subordinates. When we're building teams, clear communication, concise precision is what it's required for us to build these high performing teams. So, let me position it a different way. In the beginning, as a founder, when you launched Illoominus, you spent $49 on a logo
Oh
because you were
man, you're
really,
right.
really pressed to bring a package. You had to make a presentation, and you needed a logo and all of this. And so when I heard that interview, I said, that's probably the cheapest $49 that Noelle has ever spent. So why don't we start there? Tell the people who you are, tell the people how Illoominus came to be, and we'll just kind of take the plane from there.
Sorry I didn't land the airplane for
Oh,
you.
you did it. You did fine.
I didn't. Yeah, so hi everybody. My name's Noelle London. I'm the founder and CEO of Illoominus, based out of Atlanta, proudly building Illoominus in Atlanta. And a little bit about me is I have spent many years, over a decade, working with startups and entrepreneurs. Started my career in Nicaragua, working with female founders, fell in love with entrepreneurship as a way to solve hard problems creatively. Fast forward, knew I was always going to be launching something. So I helped a lot of people build their companies over time, learned how you build great companies over time. Most recently was working at Accenture, managing our HR technology partnerships. I'd been working in workforce development and economic development for a really long time, and naturally fell into HR tech because it was a place where I could take a lot of what I'd been doing at a macro level and really see what the impact is within an individual organization. So while I was there, saw a lot of market signals, was seeing there was some really interesting tech that was in the market, AI upskilling and reskilling, and really interesting ways to do learning and development programs. But I think through that time, and we can get more into it, Torin, but through that time saw, the messy data problem and the dirty data problem that we're going to talk about of, the data foundation just not being connected for these HR leaders. So, you want to have answers and you want to understand how the data fits together, and it makes it really hard to do so. You and I have spent a lot of time over the years talking about DEI programs and DEI technology. With Illoominus, we launched as a DEI analytics platform. I think that it was a really interesting use case to channel a lot of this work around cleaning the data foundation for HR. And so, started in the DEI analytics space. Who we are now as Illoominus is people analytics platform that brings together organizations' data across various systems. We map out the whole employee journey, and we really help people to take that data that's living within their disparate systems and turn it into actionable insights.
So I want to go back and pull something that you mentioned. You said solving hard problems.
Yeah.
And you also put yourself in a geographic location of Nicaragua. And so I am very curious because for many of us, and certainly for myself, I've never been to that region and I've never been certainly in Nicaragua specifically. And
Yeah.
so what types of hard problems were on the ground in Nicaragua? I don't want people listening to feel like they are third world and needing us to be saviors on white horses. If you,
Yeah.
but what kinds of hard problems were you seeing on the ground or in that geo?
Yeah, for sure. So, what was really interesting while I was there is, and I was there, 2011. So this was in the context of Nicaragua, a very different time in 2011. And the big problem that we saw at the time was massive shifts, which that's going to be a theme that you and I are going to talk about a lot today, is like massive shifts and massive industry shifts. And so when I was in Nicaragua, what was really interesting is they had just passed legislation where they were teaching entrepreneurship in every single high school. And so basically, my boss, who is a Nicaraguan woman, came up with the curriculum of how are we going to teach this within the schools. And so what we were doing was teaching that it was the teach the teacher model on how to teach that curriculum within high schools. Nicaraguans are naturally incredibly entrepreneurial. A lot of that is out of necessity of needing to be creative and finding solutions. But the big thing that was happening at the time is that it was very much an agricultural economy and was quickly shifting into a tourism-based economy. And so that what that meant is that there were lots of opportunities within that shift into a tourism-based economy. And what we were doing was helping individuals that wanted to start businesses to take advantage of that shift and to bring in locals into the tourism based economy that was happening. Things like, for example, swag for hotels, arts and crafts, instead of importing those from elsewhere. Like, how can we create businesses around some of those opportunities? So it was massive shifts are happening. How are we helping local Nicaraguans to take advantage of being a part of that change?
And so being with Accenture, naturally, folks enjoy having a large logo behind them. There's some degree of prestige when you work for a large organization like that. Yet you saw a need in the marketplace and you decided that you wanted to go through your own personal professional shift. And so going back to the $49 logo, it had to be more,
It
had to be
was
much
so
more
ugly
than
for
just
him.
looking at data, the other market signals. There was something going on inside of Noelle. And I'm curious if you've never shared it before, really, what was it? What was it that made you say, I'm going to walk away from the prestige of Accenture, being inside of this venture fund, being able to make decisions to fund and launch people's endeavors? Why did you say, now is that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are a lot of forces that were at play at that time. I was at Accenture. I I was at Accenture seeing so many market signals across so many different companies and hearing, like, let's funnel up the things that we're hearing. I was there during 2020 after the murder of George Floyd and others. And I think, like a lot of people, was thinking about, what is that? I was helping think about, what does our organization do within this really important moment where we have commitments that are measurable and they're tangible. And we've never had this in the same way. And in many ways, there's measurement that's being put behind this. That's a data problem. This is a data problem that we're seeing overall. But I think the big thing, Torin, and this even honestly gets into the human relationships conversation that we're going to continue to have, is seeing, okay, this is a moment where a lot of people are committing to put data and measurement behind something. We have never actually known what has worked for organizations because this has been backwards facing reporting. People haven't been sharing this data. What if, now that we have people measuring this in a very large data set, what if we can actually understand what works for the very first time? And that allows us to share that data and that understanding across organizations. And so, even as we have shifted into, there's so many different use cases to address with fixing the data foundation for HR. But for us, that's always been this North Star, is how do we this change? I mean, it was DEI at that time, organizations. I mean, it's not just that. It's like we're continuing to pile on the things that organizations are solving for. How do we bring that collective learning to understand what works and then to share those best practices across organizations? And so that's what we'll talk about around human relationships, but really, how do we use data to unlock learning about what creates better workplaces, high performance teams, et cetera, within organizations?
If you are out viewing the broadcast, I would love for you in the comment to just simply put what department, what business unit, what area of the business that you are in or you are supporting would see incredible advancement if there was a shift, if there was an unlocking, if there was a transparency around data. In the comment, write down what area, business unit, or department would really benefit from a shift in how they approach data, if you will, at this particular moment. Noelle, I'm curious, one of the phrases you used when I first met you in September of last year was dirty data. And when you
That's what
use
I'm
the
known for to
phrase,
you now, Torin.
yeah, it had been a while since I heard the phrase, and so when you said it, it was a familiar reminder. But the way that you said it and the way that you put a ribbon around how you and the team at Illoominus approaches it, for me was impactful, and it was the beginning of why you and I have continued to have a consistent dialogue. Just take a moment and share with those that are watching your definition of dirty data, and why it's extremely important that you start, or why it was extremely important that that is central to the Illoominus service offering.
Absolutely. I think that the context when you and I first started talking was around bias in AI models. And I think that's why we first started talking about this. And yes, there's bias in but I think because that comes down to what we're feeding into models. And a big thing that we see is dirty data. And what I mean by that is data that is not ready. There's things that are within the data foundation that don't create good outputs. And so some of those things that oftentimes we see when we're looking at data could be things like typos in the data, duplications. Maybe someone is looking at level data with HR and they see under not capitalized IC1. And then in another place, they're going to see IC1 capitalized. So those types of things are basic things that oftentimes aren't are happening within the data, and those are going to skew your outputs. So you and I talked a lot about, yes, everybody's thinking about AI and HR, and everybody's thinking about the outputs, but that the number one thing that individuals can be doing right now is really thinking about the data integrity that they have and spending time on cleaning that up. Because if we don't have the good data that's going into the models, it's going to be worrisome of what's coming out on the other side. And so that's really the number one place that we see folks wanting to start. It's funny because you and I think, also talked about a data maturity curve. And, you and I were talking about, examples of where people are when we really think about AI and HR. And it's kind of this S curve, if you will. And you all have probably heard of maturity models in many different contexts. But oftentimes we see, folks may think that they're further along in maturity than they actually are, because when you get into the data, you start to see the dirty data challenges that are there. We also have individuals that may think that they're worse off, and they say, "Ooh, I don't want to start because we're not in a good place." And we tend to find that those individuals may actually be further along than they think they are. So what we're kind of finding is that the real reality and the elephant in the room is, like, we're seeing that people are usually meeting the middle in terms of that maturity of, we're seeing people are really kind of around the same place and dealing with the same challenges.
Yeah, so you actually just touched on quite a bit there. When we wrote Reducing Bias in HR using artificial intelligence, that was absolutely something that we were punctual about. We pronounced it as loud as a paper possibly could, if you will. But what you said was the data that ICP, small letter I versus capitalized I, that's a difference, and that it could skew, it could impact the outcome. What I think about is, there are a couple of stages there. Number one, it is the learning large language model that the AI may be running off of, and what data was used to train that particular system. And in many instances, the customer has really no say in that process. They're just simply going out to the marketplace and purchasing a tool. But then it says to us, when on the inside, how when we are using this AI solution, is it relearning? How is it continuing to learn, to improve? And then that's where that internal data comes into play. I think about, when we talk about that dirty data, it has more ramifications. It has ramifications around compensation. It has ramifications around learning and development, progress in terms of promotions, stretch assignments. I mean, it really has. It sounds very minor to say small letter I versus large letter I, or Ronald W. Williams versus Ronald Williams. It seems very what's the word that I'm looking for? Elementary for us to be focused on that, yet it does have outsized impact, or could have outsized impact.
Yeah, and compounding over time, right? So when you start to say, and there's more of a push for this kind of data to be in leaders' hands than there ever has been before. So a big thing we talk about is regular reports that help hold department leaders accountable. And so what we're hearing a lot is, the new thing is, I want to send a report every single quarter to my leadership. The thing though, and the thing though is that, like, as you have some of those dirty data challenges, they start to compound over time of having two United States in location. Then you start looking at data, kind of forming a hypothesis of what's happening within the organization, and you may be not getting the thing that's very accurate coming out on the other side. So you're right, it does sound elementary, but to us, that's probably one of the easiest things that someone can be doing right now, as a lot of HR leaders are still trying to get policies on AI within their organizations. They're not sure what they can and can't use today on external tools. Doing this type of work in parallel to clean up systems is the work that, if you get this right now, you're going to be in a much better place as you do start to adopt some of those new tools. So I think it is the dirty data challenge on those like duplications, those typos. The other thing, though, that we see quite a bit, Torin, is we know that HR systems are not the most user friendly. And sometimes it can be hard to understand what's here and what's not here. So what we see quite a bit of is, I was in a hurry, I couldn't find the field, so I made a new field. And so people that are maybe not necessarily like going through and understanding what's available in standard fields, that is another thing that we tend to find can be messy, because maybe some people are using one field for one thing and another field for another thing. And so that way you don't necessarily have the usage of the system in the way that you're going to be able to unlock those insights. And when you start thinking about, where we're getting to and what we'll get to in this conversation is, we want to start to be able to understand, like, what are other leaders doing when XYZ is happening in the world, and I need to figure out how I respond to it within my workforce. We want to start to get to those collective learnings. You even want to be able to start doing things like internal benchmarks. You want external benchmarks. It's really hard to do that if you're not using the systems and the fields appropriately.
I love that, creating your own new field inside of the system, certainly a gift and a bit of a curse. Let's see, Halisi Tembuzi, he says that I'm in compliance and HR auditing, specifically looking at internal data. It's his first time hearing the phrase dirty data, Noelle. Thank you, Halisi, for your comment. Nautry Jones says this is extremely important and that the impact is huge. Progress and data isn't accurate. We aren't actually talking about the right things. Like, literally, we are having two very different conversations on that theme. And for those of you who are out there, make sure that you hit the share link on LinkedIn, get some more people in the room, because we are having an incredible conversation. Well, I want to know something. We titled it AI Can't Build Friendships. It's the number one thing that, not friendships, relationships. AI cannot build relationships.
Yep.
But when we think about the employee life cycle from their I'm going to say onboarding, although I believe the journey starts a lot sooner than that. But let's just say onboarding, offer letter in place to their exit, their attrition. There is an absolute direct connection between that relationship that you are talking about, the use of artificial intelligence and data right here in the middle, and that journey of growing as an employee. There is an absolute relationship. There's a marriage that takes place there. And why is it that you feel organizations have allowed themselves to operate with dirty data?
Why do we think that organizations have been allowed to operate with dirty data? I think because that's a whole other conversation, but I think it's because HR systems, HR tools and resources have been chronically underfunded. And so when you think about it, the thing that always pops up in our minds is 40 to 80% of an organization's budget every single year is going to employees.
And what do
Going
you mean when you say that?
What I mean is 40 to 80% of an organization's entire budget is going to employees. sometimes up to 80% of an organization's budget. So that's your biggest spend as a company, but yet you don't know how that investment is working for you because you don't have the visibility and the data and the insights to understand. And so we're I think that like the reality and the elephant in the room is we've got this disconnect happening where we've got CEOs asking HR leaders, how do we bring AI into HR? We should just, automate some processes. Do we need as many people to be doing what we're doing? We're having that kind of like top down ask, how can you automate a lot of this work? We've got vendors that are talking about things that they're not gonna have available for a year out, and they're talking if like they're available today. And then the reality is the HR leaders, because these systems haven't necessarily been invested in the past, are dealing with, I've got to figure out the basics before I can even leverage what a lot of vendors are out there selling. And so I think it's, when you look at um, spend on technology, yes, for like the basic systems and payroll, because those are super important. That's where your spend's going. But when you think about, HR for the most part, and I will say we work for the most part with middle market companies. So, the 20,000 employees and less or so, when you look at those companies, they're oftentimes needing to lean on IT to be able to get data and reporting. So, what that means is every time I want something and understanding of my data, I've probably got to go to the IT team and ask for some help because that's where the data resources exist. That IT team is going to say, I'm going to push revenue marketing teams, they're going to go to the top of the stack in my to-do list. And because this is HR and this is internal, it's probably getting stuck at the back of the to-do list and probably not happening. And so while there's a lot of conversation around, and we don't even need to get into that, like IT and HR coming together, but I think part of that has been, where systems have been managed within the organization. This is an internal function, so it's going to the back of the to-do list.
IT and HR are going to come together. And whether they like it or not, I believe that artificial intelligence is going to force them to play much better in the sandbox, if you will. I really believe that HR leaders in the future, not so distant future, are going to become closer in functionality and awareness to a CTO, CIO like individual. And CTOs and CIOs may be closer in some of their functionality and presence like an HR person. I literally believe that, especially when we have a plethora of agents inside of our organizations, there is going to be a bit of a blur in that particular sandbox. I want to go to something that you said around the spend going to employees. When I hear spend, of course, I think about some of the natural suspects of compensation. I think about that learning and development investment, some allocation for people or employees to do events and conferences and whatnot. But one of the pieces that I also think about heavily, and I don't know if it's given enough consideration, is the benefits. And I've often said that if we had more data around how Noelle takes advantage of the benefits and how Torin exercises his benefit allocation. Yeah, we may have made some choices in January, but how did we exercise? How did we deploy? How did we go after, leveraging that? Do you see inside of, and I'm not asking for inside baseball, but do you see inside of the organizations that Illoominus is supporting Noelle, do you see them catching data stratas around benefit
Yeah, I
usage?
love that you asked that question because it I think it really what we've been able to do is really help customers look at the data more like within the context and look at the data more holistically. Because I think you're exactly right of you've got different levers as an organization. It's not just compensation, it's, at key milestones, what levers are we pulling around things like learning and development, around things like benefits? Because when we think of, hey, the hire to fire metrics or hire to offboarding metrics, that type of data will come from like an HRIS system and talent acquisition, employee engagement, and performance. And those four data sets can tell us so much about someone's journey. So, for example, we were recently working with a retail customer, and retail in particular is higher on that end of like usually around 70% of their budget is employee spend, so it's even higher. When we first started working with them, turnover rates were really high, and their turnover rates were actually lower than some others within the industry. But turnover rates, like benchmarking wise, we see between about 60% or so and 200% turnover every single year, typically with a retailer. The big problem is they had so much velocity of change and they couldn't exactly pinpoint why. So I'm telling you, we've got these four different systems that are telling us these sourcing to offboarding metrics. But to your point, these things like learning and development, like benefits, these are the kinds of things that can influence that employee journey. So what we were able to do is look at correlations between training, looking at scheduling, looking at things like benefits to help to understand if we were to use those levers, does that actually bring down attrition in the long run? What we found is that, especially because they had a large frontline workforce, a big reason when we were doing the correlations was that their part-time employees were actually not getting enough hours. So they were having to leave to go to a different role. Excuse. So by pulling that together on the scheduling data, they weren't getting enough hours to stay at the organization and they needed to leave. So by bringing learning and development in and bringing more certifications to those individuals, having the learning and development allow them to get more hours, which was attributed to helping them stay. There's also a big movement right now. We've been helping on some of this analysis as well, is looking at benefits. So, for example, if you've got a very large frontline workforce that potentially is working hourly, do you actually bring down, do you bring up the number of hours so that someone is getting benefits and minimize the number of part-time employees? So Gap, for example, has done this recently on starting to shift their part-timers into full-timers, covering those benefits, and they're actually finding that it's saving them on that turnover cost. So, those are some of the things, yes, that come together as you're able to actually bring together this data that's been living in different systems. Those types of learnings have been really hard to get to. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking to solve.
And now is actually a good time to talk a bit about how you have differentiated Illuminus in the marketplace. Certainly, you are up against, and I don't mean it as in direct
Right.
competition, but if you do a bit of research, folks will find that there are some recognized names in your marketplace. While they don't serve the same client that you serve, now's a good time for you to talk about, the distinction of Illuminus, and why it is that you all have been very successful in helping organizations pull from 16, 20, 25, 30, maybe even more systems and give them useful, not just reporting, but useful reporting. Talk about that while I flash a QR code for anyone out there. QR code is going to take you to the demo page on the Illuminus website. but share what differentiates Illuminus from some of the other names that
Yeah,
they will
for
see.
sure. And so, Torin, one of the big things that we saw, and we talked earlier about how I was spending more time with enterprise like customers as organizations have been asking HR for more data. The challenge that we've seen is that middle market companies, in particular, are who we work with. So we think about those being the companies that are like 500 to 15,000 employees. At that point, typically a middle market company has two options. They can either build it themselves, or they can and have to figure it out, come into a blank page, start from scratch, or they can go and try and leverage an enterprise tool, but those tools are oftentimes going to be far too heavy for a middle market company. And so what we've done is built with middle market customers in mind as we've built Illuminus, to really think about, how do we make this self-serve? How do we make this user experience easy to navigate? So that's been a really big focus of ours is, as a middle market company, instead of you necessarily needing to build this yourself, you can now come into a fully built out platform on day one and then customize it to your needs. But even not necessarily having to put developers around the solution just to make it work. You can come in and use plain text to be able to add new views. You don't have to know SQL code, that type of thing. So I think that the big way that we think about differentiating ourselves is who we're serving, is the kind of customer that we're serving. That HR leader that's probably had to go to IT in the past just to get answers. We want to put that data in an empowering and accessible way in their hands, and we've built for that. The other thing I would say is, back to the point that we talked about earlier on community. We built a community organically from day one, with Illuminus, bringing together chief people officers because we knew that by bringing folks together, we could help them to share best practices and have insights on what others are doing. And so, as I think about, and we have some really exciting news coming up in the next week or so, that we'll make sure, Torin, you're in the loop on. But as we think about the platform moving forward, we've always had this North Star of we want to be able to help organizations understand what other organizations are doing in terms of best practices so that HR leaders don't feel alone and like they have to figure this stuff out on their own. So, in addition to us bringing some really exciting AI and automation into the platform, we're really becoming a community developed platform. And so that's something that we're has always been a part of us, but we're really excited to launch officially on the product side.
Stay there for a moment. What does a community developed platform actually mean? It sounds beautiful for LinkedIn and a LinkedIn
Yeah.
Live, but in practice, what does that mean? For a person who's going to watch the replay,
Yeah.
what does that mean? For someone who might see me capture that line and share it in a clip, what does a community developed platform mean?
Yeah. So, what we're bringing into the platform is a community of best practices. So, when you come into the platform today, we've built this in a way that's flexible and customizable for a mid market company. So, you can come in, you're going to have Illuminous People Analytics ready on day one. You're not having to think about, um, what's a calculation, I have to come up with all of the basic governance data definition type work. That's available on day one. You can also customize and configure the platform. The other thing that we're doing is we have templatized views within the platform. So you can come in and pull from a library and pull off of the shelf on views that are going to be helpful for you as well. So the community is contributing to those over time so that I can come in and say, there's a specific thing that has come up that I need to have access to. For example, remember when I-9 statuses changed and everybody was thinking about how do I manage that? that's the type of thing that as new views are coming available and new learnings are coming available, that you have the ability to pull those off of the shelf as well. So we've built that in terms of the flexibility of how you can leverage the platform and build out the platform. The other thing is around benchmarking and understanding. And so when you're coming into the platform, let's say we were talking about retail earlier, we can keep talking about retail. Let's say that I'm a retailer, I'm coming into the platform to understand correlations between performance metrics and turnover and engagement. When I'm coming into the platform, I'm not only looking at my data as a retailer, I'm looking at aggregated and anonymized learnings across the industry. So what I can see is, and this is aggregated and anonymized, but I can see how am I doing relative to other retailers that are the same size, the same industry, and the same geography.
So you just said we're going to be making an announcement and we're bringing artificial intelligence
Mhm.
into the platform.
Yep.
That hits my ear
Sure.
um, with the suggestion that AI has not been in the platform up until this point or recently. What guided you and the team on how you explored the infusion and future deployment of of artificial intelligence? Was it sentiment data from your clients, signals from your clients? Is it a band of research from PhDs and advisory board? What influenced how you have massaged and said this is how we will ethically and we will use AI moving forward?
Yeah. Well, I'm not necessarily saying that we haven't been doing those things. I think we have. We haven't been talking as much about them of what we've been working on things like predictive analytics, being able to look at things like predicting turnover. What we are talking about now and announcing now that we're really excited about is the ability to ask any questions of any data securely that's coming into the platform. So what that means is, let's say that I have pulled in my engagement data, I've pulled in my HRAS data, my talent acquisition data. I can now be able to draw insights across that journey by asking any question of my data. So, as you all know, I mean, there's people are going to use platforms in different ways. We have data visualization, of course, but sometimes you're going to need those quick answers when you got the 10:30 p.m. email on a Sunday night and some CEO is asking you a question. This is the way that you can get those instant answers that you've been needing. And so really excited about that and just the ability to put the insights and the answers into HR's hands that don't require building a view to get the answer. The other thing that we're doing is the ability to actually launch and build your own dashboards off of plain text. So we can actually visualize, tell me about tenure across my departments. You can put simply that phrase, and then now we are visualizing that for you, and you can add that to my dashboard. So things that would usually take organizations months, especially a smaller organization, you can now actually build within minutes. And I do
So,
want to talk about the ethical piece at some point, but we don't have to, we can do that after your question.
no, please go ahead. You can do
I'm
that.
saying like so I don't forget.
Yeah, yeah. No, you can do that. Do that.
Well, the one thing I did really want to mention is Torin, we talked about the initial way that we built Illuminus was really mindful on, hey, we're asking individuals for sensitive data. We're working with global organizations. It was really important to us that as we were building trust between HR and people teams that are asking questions of employees, that both sides felt trust around it. For that reason, we actually built from the beginning of Illoominus a personally identifiable information scrubber. What that means is that somebody can answer a question, and the company does not have the ability to get down to the individual level of that data, so that that data is never used against an employee. Let's take, LGBTQ plus laws in certain countries versus others. We still want to be able to understand how somebody is experiencing the organization, but we don't necessarily want to identify an individual. All of that to be said is that's core. It's core to who we are, and with AI and what we're adding into the platform, no PII is actually ingested when you're using our AI tools.
My reason for looking down, looking up. Um, I think back to a consulting engagement that I was in where a transgender employee confided in their leader. Um, and no one in the or relatively few people in the organization knew that this person was
Yep.
transgender. And the leader not only told other leaders, but would begin to tell some of the colleagues of the employee. And my pause, my looking down and looking up is because I so despise the fact that we have to anonymize so tightly personal identifying information, where I feel like it's that it's that lack of trust in an organization, that potential for retaliation, that harmfulness of the whistleblower, that relationship that we talked about in our headline. It's the lack of that, it's the absence of that, which is causing so many organizations, in my opinion, to not unlock their truest level of potential, whatever that is. And so just to hear that even in 2025, you are still having to intentionally build these sort of tools and escape hatches, if you will, it reinforces how much more work we have to do in terms of building leaders who can stand and lead in these various environments.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's the same reason why looking at an engagement survey isn't going to be super valuable for you, because who actually feels comfortable sharing their real perspective on an engagement survey, that they're not going to be that's not going to be used against them. And so that's why I think looking at the data holistically of, as organizations, like organizations broadly are dealing with a whole lot of disengagement right now. Engagement surveys aren't going to tell us people are disengaged as much as like bring that data together with performance data, with promotions data, with turnover data. Look at that on an org chart and see under which leaders are you starting to see their hotspots. That's going to be a whole lot more impactful and telling than um, putting the burden, frankly, on the individual to share that information.
If there are any questions, drop them in the chat on LinkedIn. I will absolutely address them before we finish the broadcast. Noelle, I do have a question for you,
Yeah.
specifically around value, if you will. When I'm working with a client, I tend to tell them, this is how you can measure the diversity and inclusion support that we are providing. You will see engagement go up. You will see productivity, personal, individual productivity rise, and you will see some degree of retention extend. You will see maybe positive attrition, meaning organizationally people will move inside of the organization. How do you want people to measure you in the Illuminous solution? Is there a formula Is it something that is uniform? Does it vary from customer to customer, industry to industry? How is Illuminus measured?
Yeah. What I will say is that you are going to see different organizations. There's always like a problem du jour, right? Like it was turnover last year, it's disengagement right now. There are different things that organizations are solving for. And we're that data solution where through the ups and downs, like you have the continuity and the history to understand what's actually happening in your organization. And so we are going to be looking at different metrics along the way. But the end goal is how do we create high performance teams? And so it's all about like we're connecting your data for the whole employee journey because what we're trying to understand is how do people do great work while they're there? How do other people grow within the organization while they're there? And so we're looking at that journey. We're seeing like, are we adding in benefits? Are we adding in learning and development? What are we doing to create a great experience for this employee that's going to make them do the best work of their lives? And so ultimately, what we're all driving towards is how do we create high performing organizations?
Absolutely. Question from the audience. Brian asks, "What is the role of HR and HR tech with DEI in 2025 and 26?"
What is the role of HR tech with DEI? I still think it's a lot of it is data and having the data to back what you're seeing within the organization. Are you looking at, I was just looking at, you can do a 2 by 2 matrix where it's like talk about representation within the organization on one matrix, talk about representation within, let's say, promotions on the other matrix. So you can start to see, are we seeing where we have more representation in certain groups? And is that correlated with where we're seeing opportunities go? Is that correlated with, is there something happening on turnover? Is there something happening on disengagement? So I still think looking at leverage the data to tell the stories of are people from certain groups having different experiences or experiences where we really want to pay attention and go and act on those things. Are we seeing that there's representation when people are getting their next opportunities? Are we seeing that more people from certain groups are leaving the organization? Paying close attention to those things are things that I think luckily, when we were having this conversation in 2021, a lot of those systems weren't tracking a lot of that data. That data is in a lot of HR systems now. Let's use it to understand what's going on and where we need to address some of those gaps.
So I have two questions for you. One deals with Illuminous, one deals with you. Let me go with the first one. And I want to connect the first one to something you said in the very, very beginning. You talk about your time abroad. We talked in our headline here, human relationships. I have long believed that the reason why so many people are successful, it is a result of their experience and their exposure. I believe that your time on the ground in Nicaragua has some influence on how you show up in this marketplace as a founder, as a woman-led founder, as an HR tech company. I feel like it's that combination of things, but I don't want to assume. So, what drives Noelle? How is Noelle shaped? I have a phrase, principle over technique. Talk a bit about Noelle's principle for those that are watching so they have an idea of why they should be clicking on the QR code and gaining a demo from this particular founder.
Yeah. I think what drives me is creative problem solving. I think that's the thing that uh I went to Nicaragua, was got a letter saying you're going to be teaching entrepreneurship in Spanish in 3 months. and I didn't know what the word entrepreneurship meant. And I showed up and I realized quickly what entrepreneurship was creative problem solving. I realized like I'd been a founder as a teenager. I didn't even have the word for it. Like this has always been building something. But to me, what motivates me is building something to solve real problems. And to me, a lot of what we're talking about right now is this is the problem of our times, in many ways, like the amount of change that we're seeing in the workforce, AI, automation, what do the future of companies look like? How do we keep the people within the future of companies and do that in a way where it's holistic. I studied on economics undergrad. Um, my favorite class was not because of the environment, but it was called environmental economics. And it was basically about how these systems of economics break down because they're too simplistic and they're not looking at the whole picture. That's how I think about the future of the workforce is right now, you have organizations that say we're laying off 1,600 people because of AI and automation. That's really short-sighted because what it's not doing is the future of us having organizations is not Noelle for this job. It's Noelle for these skills for the thing that I need at the time. And then how do I move Noelle into her next role? And so as I think of just the massive amounts of change, the like switching of widgets of hire fire is not the way that we should be doing this. I believe in holistic decision making. And that's why I think that we need to bring all of this data together to be able to make better decisions.
For those of you out, please grab your camera, take a photo, as well as scan the QR code yourself, but take a photo and post the photo on your social media. You may not repost the video exchange, but at minimum, put the QR code up and put some affirming words to this particular founder, Noelle London, and the team and what they are doing over at Illoominus. Final question for you, Noelle, is what's next? You shared with us that an announcement is coming out, so we
Yeah.
get that part. But when you think about the moonshot for Illoominus, when you think about the criticality of the time that we are in, what's next? And that may be a 12-month question, an 18-month question, but what is that moonshot for the incredible work that you and the team are doing?
Yeah. I think it's about what we believe is by bringing together a community of best practices in our data platform, it allows leaders to make these holistic strategic decisions. It allows them to have a place to go for support as they're figuring out these massive pieces. Like HR will continue to play such a critical role in workforces as they're changing. And so I think what we continue to build is this community of best practices in the Illoominus platform. And I think that's where we're really doubling down on differentiation. It's not just about workflow automation, it's about strategy, it's about decision making. I mentioned, we've been really focused on getting the data foundation right for HR within the platform right now. When I think about the moonshot and when I talk about, this is the problem of our times, I really, the thing that I have my eye on and that our team has our eye on is how do we move people in this massive change? How do we help organizations rethink about internal mobility and how we move people through organizations? That is, we've got the data foundation right. That's chapter one. When I think about chapter two, it's how do we now help on workforce planning?
Noelle, I appreciate you for spending a bit of time with me and with them, all of them. I appreciate you giving me that nice, affirming smile in the beginning. I thought about Dirty Diana and Michael Jackson's song as I was doing one of our posts earlier today. My hope is that you and people in your digital tribe and in my digital tribe will go back and replay the conversation. Even more than that, my hope is that individuals watching this will reach out to you and the team and at least at minimum take a demo. If not for them, take the demo and be able to explain to someone else why they need to reach out to Illoominus. And by the way, how long is a typical demo for you all? Is it 20 minutes, 30 minutes, a little longer?
We can make it as fast as you need. No, but usually we do like a 30-minute demo. There's a 3-minute demo video on our website, so feel free to check that out if it seems like it might be the right fit, or if you even just have some questions and want to talk shop about HR data, we'd love to talk to you and share of what we're seeing across other organizations.
Noelle, I appreciate you. Convey my appreciation to Marcus for all of his marketing support prior to our conversation.
Yeah.
You and I will talk real soon. All right.
Thanks, Torin. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
All right. Bye.
Take care.